bloody cat. Are you
delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too. Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. In yet more persuasive evidence that it's time Britain ought to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, the Battle of the Boyne returns in a courtroom drama as Southern Ireland has decided to take the United Kingdom to court in a challenge to our own domestic law, the Troubles Immunity Bill. But in another battle, this time the Battle of the Boilers, the Tory temperature is rising as backbenchers are mobilising against the Prime Minister's plans for a net zero boiler tax. But will the Prime Minister stick to his own promise? One Tucker Carlson over in the United States of America has spread the mistruth that Winston Churchill put the opposition in prison with their families during World War II. Tonight, I will be suggesting he corrects the record. And Big Brother is watching more of you than ever before, as a new law will enable the police to run facial recognition of 50 million Britons using their driving licences. But isn't this a CCP-esque authoritarian measure? Plus, as death duty receipts hit £5.2 billion, the controversial tax is expected to be a key battleground at the next election. Surely it's time to axe the tax. State of the Nation starts now. Joined by the most intellectual panel this evening, GB News' senior political commentator Nigel Nelson and the editor of Conservative Home, Paul Goodman. As always, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me on mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time for the news of the day with Sam Francis.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening. I'm Sam Francis. The headlines at 8. Police in Prague say a large number of weapons have been uncovered at the university building where more than 15 people have been killed in a mass shooting. At least 24 others are wounded, and reports say the shooter was a student at the Faculty of Arts at Charles University. His body has also been found in the area. Czech police say the suspect's father was also found dead earlier today. Officers responded to reports of a shooter on a roof at around 2 o'clock UK time this afternoon. Prague's police chief has told reporters there is fresh but unconfirmed information that the 24-year-old may have been inspired by similar terror attacks. Here in the UK, a murder investigation has been launched after a 4-year-old boy died following a knife attack in East London. The Metropolitan Police said that they received a call just before 11 o'clock last night, raising concerns for the welfare of a child at a property in Hackney. The boy was found with knife injuries and was taken to hospital, where he later died. A 41-year-old woman has been arrested on suspicion of murder. An inquest into the death of the asylum seeker aboard the Bibi Stockholm barge has found that he died from compression of the neck caused by hanging. The Albanian asylum seeker was found unresponsive aboard the barge in Dorset on the 12th of December. The coroner said there weren't thought to be any suspicious circumstances surrounding the death of the 27-year-old, and a pre-inquest review is to be held in July of next year. Meanwhile, ministers appear to have stepped back from their plans to increase the minimum income for requirements for migrants. The Home Secretary had told the Commons that the threshold would rise from £18,600 to £30,700 by next spring. That was in a bid to tackle rising net migration. But instead of immediately increasing the amount, documents released by the Home Office say that it will now rise in stages. First, to the lower figure of £29,000 in the spring of next year. Though James Cleverly says the plans will still bring net migration down by 300,000 people a year. In the US, Donald Trump's former lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, has filed for bankruptcy. That's just days after being ordered to pay more than £116 million for defaming two women. He had claimed that surveillance footage showed the two election workers concealing and counting suitcases filled with illegal ballots. It led to them receiving racist messages, including threats of lynching, and they were forced to relocate. A federal judge ruled this week that Giuliani must immediately begin paying the two women, saying that there was a risk that he may attempt to conceal his assets. Well, here in the UK, there's been more disruption to Christmas getaways, with hundreds of passengers left stranded in Euston Station. Last-minute Eurostar strikes forced cross-channel rail services to be suspended and cancelled trains added to the mass disruption. That strike, though, in France has now ended after an agreement was reached with unions, the Eurotunnel has said. And winds of up to 115 miles an hour are adding to that travel chaos as Storm Pia sweeps across parts of the UK. One man has been taken to hospital after a tree fell on his car in Derbyshire. British Airways flights have also been disrupted, and the National Rail has reported that routes across Scotland, parts of England and Wales are also affected. A yellow weather warning is in place in Scotland until 9 o'clock this evening, just an hour left for that warning, and it also covers Belfast, Newcastle and Manchester. This is GB News across the UK. We're on your TV, in your car, digital radio and on your smart speaker. Now, though, it's back to Jacob.
The government of the Republic of Ireland is taking the United Kingdom government to court over the Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy Bill. The bill was passed in September and it gives a limited amnesty to those involved in the Troubles after having seen historic prosecutions from that period. What the bill seeks to do is to bring this problem to an end by giving an amnesty to soldiers and indeed terrorists if they cooperate with the new Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery, providing the information that will allow families who have not found out what happened to their family members and friends in the past to get the information that they need. And in the lead up to the bill's introduction, when it was still a bill, it had been suggested that it could be incompatible with the ECHR because of the fact that the ECHR has ruled against amnesties in the past. But this issue refers us back to the fundamental fissure within British politics today. Where does power lie? Some people believe in international law with unaccountable judges who have free rein, in the case of the ECR, to expand the scope of its jurisdiction with no democratic mandate or real legitimacy. Others believe, as I do, in parliamentary sovereignty, that Parliament is the highest court in the land as your representative, as the representative of a sovereign people. Those who believe in parliamentary sovereignty have the Constitution on their side. Historically, parliamentary sovereignty is the underpinning of our unwritten Constitution. It recognises that the law and politics must coexist and that good government requires flexibility. In this case, to bring to an end endless investigations of old men for long since past events, if they are willing to cooperate in explaining what happened and revealing the truth to those who were affected all this time ago. But this is fundamentally a political choice. When you're settling a long-running period of disorder, of terrorism, there are hard choices to be made. Terrorists who had committed murder were let out of prison in a way, in a means, in an effort to achieve peace. Difficult things. have to be done. And it's a political choice about the best way to maintain peace in Northern Ireland. So that a foreign government should seek to overrule such a decision in a foreign court is a monstrous intervention in our sovereignty, which the Irish would deeply resent if we tried to do it to them. If His Majesty's government took the Irish government to court, the accusations of colonialism would be heard screeching all the way to Washington, D.C. It is our country, and maintaining peace within it must be our choice, even if those choices are difficult and include the potential of an amnesty for terrorists, which is included within this Act. As ever, I want to hear from you, mailmog@gbnews.com, and I'm delighted now to be joined by Fadi Farhat, the legal consultant specialising in human rights and immigration. Thanks so much for coming in. This Act is a very difficult Act. The Unionists don't like it because it potentially gives an amnesty to terrorists. The Republicans don't like it because it potentially gives an amnesty to soldiers. But with a peace process, ultimately political decisions have to be made, which are difficult for everybody. And it seems to me to think that this can be judged as a matter of human rights is a fundamental mistake.
Thank you, Jacob. The human rights element comes in because we're dealing with historic deaths, estimated to be about 3,600 deaths in the midst of the troubles that occurred in Northern Ireland historically. The human rights dimension relates effectively to Article 2 of the ECHR, which provides the right to life. And of course, where life has been taken, the principle that the state should conduct an effective investigation into what happened, to give closure to victims, to learn lessons, to find out what went wrong so that we can avoid it in the future. That principle in itself, underpinned usually by having an inquest, is something that we all would agree with in any event. So notwithstanding it's enshrined in the ECHR, it's still something that is part and parcel of what we expect from government, which is to investigate when things go wrong. And that's really the starting point here. So in substance, I don't think many will disagree that when we have atrocities from either side, that we would expect some mechanism from which to seek redress and learn lessons from.
And it's worth bearing in mind they're overwhelmingly from the terrorist side, that there are some from British forces, but they are a very small percentage of the total.
That's correct, yes.
But your point on inquests is a fair one, but the Act provides that you only get this amnesty if you're willing to cooperate with an investigatory body to try and find out what actually happened, which is, of course, what the families have been asking for, that they should know. And that, again, is why it seems odd that this is fundamentally political. There are difficult circumstances where there have been terrible troubles, where states have to take extraordinary action. And for a foreign government to try and take this to court seems to me extraordinarily ill-advised of the Irish government.
Yeah, I would agree. Personally, notwithstanding the framework that exists and that I support that framework, I think that the challenge is somewhat misguided. And I actually think that the Act in general, and this is my personal opinion, is compatible. And I think it's compatible for two reasons. The Irish Republic's position is that the Strasbourg court has said that, in theory, as a default position, almost as a starting point, although I hesitate to use that term, starting point, but the default position is that immunity from prosecution is an amnesty. I mean, this Act doesn't use the word amnesty, but in effect it is an amnesty. And the Strasbourg court has held that amnesties in general are incompatible. However, the Strasbourg court itself has opened the door to say that in certain circumstances, amnesties could be justified if they promote the aim of reconciliation, community cohesion. And it is that point that the UK government is seeking to say that the nature of this legislation has a special character to it. And in 1991, the Strasbourg court itself, in a case against France, held that the amnesty operated there by France upon independence in New Caledonia had a special character because the aim was to foster reconciliation and community cohesion and to draw a line under the sand. And I would say that on the facts of this case, the UK government has probably struck that balance by creating this new commission. And this commission, and as you pointed out, the amnesty applies to both sides. And of the 3,600 deaths, about 2,000 are estimated or attributed to deaths caused by Republican paramilitary. So that's more than half. And in that sense, it's about drawing the line under the sand. And the UK government's case is that the Troubles and what happened in Northern Ireland has a sort of special character to it that can justify a departure from the usual principle, as was held by the Strasbourg court in 1991 in the case involving France.
And that's very interesting. One of the things that's fascinating about this act is it is opposed by both the Unionists and by the Republicans, but that both of them have something from it that they like as well. So the Unionists want to see the prosecution of soldiers stopped, and the Republicans want to see the prosecution of their supporters stopped. And so I'm just worried that the Irish government is coming in rather heavy-handedly into a very sensitive situation where people who formally oppose it have found that they can live with it, who are the main participants in the peace process. Just a very odd thing for the Irish government to do.
It is very odd. And as you said, the Act gives both sides something. And it's that characteristic of the legislation that perhaps makes it special in character and fosters the aim of reconciliation. Because usually the default position of amnesties being incompatible with the ECHR is based on amnesties usually providing immunity for state actors. Here it's for both sides. And not only that, there's been precedent for it even in the Northern Ireland context. I think in 1998 there was legislation which provided for the early release of prisoners.
Yeah,
now that's amnesty-like. It's not quite an amnesty because, of course, to be a prisoner, you would have had to be convicted.
The process, yes.
And then in 1999, there was an actual amnesty for paramilitary kidnappers. Nobody complained.
Nobody complained about that.
Not a single complaint then.
Yes.
So this new legislation could be seen. I mean, taking in isolation, it perhaps is not that pleasant, but it could be seen as a continuum of those earlier processes where nobody batted an eyelid.
Well, thank you so much for a really excellent explanation of what is happening. We may disagree on the ECHR, but I think what you've explained today has been extremely helpful. I'm very grateful. Thank you. Well, we've covered the revamp of the Battle of the Boyne, but after the break, it's going to be the Battle of the Boilers, as the government faces rising temperatures from backbenchers over net zero costs. Plus, is Big Brother watching you?
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel. Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is Still State of the Nation. We've been discussing the Government of Ireland taking His Majesty's government to the European Court, and you've been sending in your forthright views. Peter says Peter doesn't pull his punches. Leo Varadkar, the Irish Prime Minister, is a well-known serial Anglophobe and a fanatic EU-phile. So it's not really surprising he's embarked on this mischief-making of the EU's amnesty law. Steve says, dear Jacob, the ECHR is a joke. You are correct. Our Parliament is sovereign. We must stop this. Great show as always. Thanks, Steve. Messages like this are always very popular. And Nellie says, we've given too much amnesty to Northern Ireland. Terror convicts already. Terrorists should never be let out of prison. Well, it seems the Tory temperature is ramping up on the backbenches as reports are suggesting rebels are gearing up for a rebellion against an anti-boiler net zero tax. A vote will go before the Commons some point in the new year, which would see harmful taxes imposed on boiler companies that don't reach heat pump targets. Inevitably, any costs imposed on manufacturers will be passed on to you, on to consumers. Yet another stealth tax. The Prime Minister appeared to flirt with popularity earlier this year when he delayed a number of the upcoming bans on boilers and new petrol and diesel cars. And he said, at least for now, it should be for you, the consumer, that makes that choice, not government forcing you to do it. So it's a pity that he could undermine his own potential popularity with this stealthy policy. With me now is my heavyweight intellectual panel, senior political commentator at GB News, Nigel Nelson, and the editor of Conservative Home, Paul Goodman. Nigel, what is the point of being popular if then your ministers announced completely opposite policy 3 months later?
Well, more to the point, what is the point of actually going for a net zero target in 2050 and then doing things that will make it more difficult to get there? We'll do the same thing here as we did with the ageing population. We knew 50 years ago an ageing population put pressure on the NHS, would cause problems with pensions. We could have started raising the retirement age very, very gradually so people barely felt it. We didn't. We're doing the same thing with climate change.
Paul?
Well, it's not unreasonable, I think, to try to have a policy that lowers emissions. I'm sceptical, I must say, about the targets, because I think the nearer you get to a target, the more likely the government is to drop it. And that's been the lesson of the last few years. But in this particular case, I must say I'd rather see it done by incentives rather than by punishment. So tax incentives rather than tax increases.
And it's a penalty that can go up. It'll start at £130 per boiler is the estimate. But if the companies don't install more and more heat pumps every year, the penalty goes up and up.
And you have to ask what the right lever to achieve this is. Is the right lever tax increases and more regulation, or is it, as it very often is, actually tax incentives?
Well, or is there any lever at all? I mean, the Chinese are pumping out carbon dioxide regardless. We're 1% of global emissions. A tax on boilers isn't going to make a blind bit of difference, but will make British voters worse off. Isn't this just crazy politics?
Well, if you don't believe in climate change, then yes, it would be.
Well, no, it's not if you don't believe in it. It's if you don't believe that these sorts of fatuous things will make a blind bit of difference.
But the next stage of that is that because somebody else is not doing enough, we therefore should do nothing. And I don't see the logic of that. What you're talking about here is we want 4% of heat pumps by next year, otherwise they get fined, I think, £3,000 per unit that they don't produce, 6% by 2026. Again, carrot and stick. That seems the right way of actually doing it.
But it's all stick.
Well,
where are the carrots? Are they left for Rudolph?
I think there's an important consideration here we haven't discussed so far, which is that the policy's got to have three legs to it. One is reducing emissions, and we can argue about that. The other is it's got to be fair to consumers. Then there's a sort of third leg to the stool. You'll know this very well, being an ex-energy secretary, which is energy security. And in principle, it's a good thing to generate more of your own energy rather than being reliant on oil and gas from abroad.
Indeed, not the heat pumps necessarily do that because you need lots of electricity. So, speaking of intelligent net zero, plans for the world's biggest wind farm off the coast of Norfolk have been approved. A Danish renewable energy giant, Ørsted, not to be confused with Ofsted, who looks at schools, is investing £8 billion in the project, which is expected to generate power for 3 million homes. The wind farm is expected to offer £73 per megawatt hour, whilst Hinkley Point C is roughly £120 per megawatt hour. No doubt this shows that technology can lower prices, but we must let technology lead the way and the markets will follow, rather than the government leading the way and often getting it wrong. And Paul, this is the type of net zero policy that I'm most in favour of, that actually £73 an hour is still expensive compared to pre-Ukraine gas, but it's not outrageous. And that if you can generate electricity with good technology at a reasonable price, then consumers will adopt it regardless.
There was enormous protest from your colleagues during a previous parliament when it was suggested we ought to have lots of onshore wind because that was held to be, I think rightly, quite environmentally destructive and not pleasant to see the countryside surrounded by wind turbines. It is, on the whole, better if you have them offshore in this way.
And they produce more wind. And Nigel, to your earlier point, that these are things that are actually effective and cost-effective, and that you need to wait for the technology to be right. And the reason, to go back to the boilers, they're a mistake, they don't really work.
Well, just to go back to boilers, yes. I mean, the technology on boilers needs to improve. We can't have one in our house, for instance, because we haven't got the room for the actual unit. But when it comes to the wind farm, 3 cheers for this. This is exactly the kind of thing that we need. 271 turbines off the Norfolk coast. You're not actually impinging on anyone's property or anything like that. Yes, all you can say is let's go for things like this as much as possible and get energy costs down by having renewables.
And it is all about ultimately having cheap energy. That any policy that leads to expensive energy makes people cold and poor ultimately won't work.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes.
And so this is a policy actually we can all agree on and welcome.
I mean, we can. It's not just, of course, about cost. It's also about energy security and emissions. So you have to have all 3 legs of your stool.
And the drawback to wind is that it's not energy security, because there's a wonderful GridWatch website. If you look at this, when it's really cold and the wind doesn't blow, all our electricity is still coming.
Of course, but when the wind does blow, you are getting some. So.
And we store it
supplies there.
And then we store it.
But we haven't worked out how to store it yet.
No, well, but they are working on that. It would be, either hydrogen or something like that. But the idea would be we produce it, put it on the grid when it's needed, store it when it's not.
Well, I happen to think hydrogen is a very exciting opportunity. It's the one sort of bit of greenery that I really believe in. And it can be pumped through gas pipes as well, so then you can go back to having your boiler. The only new regulation I agreed to as my brief period as Energy Secretary was an extra cost of £5 to boilers to make sure...
How long was that, by the way?
For a short number of days. But it was...
So you didn't have time to approve anymore, or you didn't want to approve anymore?
I didn't want to approve anymore. It was to make sure boilers could be hydrogen compatible. Anyway, thank you to my brilliant panel. Coming up, is Britain destined to become a big brother state as facial recognition continues to be rolled out? Plus, a public service announcement regarding champagne, which I'm sure you'll all enjoy.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GBNews. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GBNews. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too. No way will I consider the heat pump. Letters to the Daily Telegraph say they are rubbish. Camilla says, I'm sure Mayor Khan, who rejects Ukraine's plea for scrappage vehicles, would love people to be cold or even poorer at home. A thoroughly nice man. Yes, I did say that about him yesterday. He is in person. Anyway, it's another story. Aileen says, I watch your programme every evening, thank you very much, and I really enjoy it. I wish you and your family a very happy Christmas and a peaceful New Year, also to your sister. Thank you, I'll pass that on. When you go to Christmas Mass, please say a special prayer for me, and if you have time, light a candle for my family. God bless, always. Well, a couple of years ago, I went to St Augustine's at Ramsgate for midnight Mass in the old form, the Latin rite. It was absolutely beautiful, and I would recommend anyone who's near Ramsgate to go there at midnight Mass on Sunday. Anyway, it seems Big Brother could be watching more of you now than ever before. New legislation is set to provide the police with powers that will enable them to use the database containing all 50 million driving licence pictures in Britain in the latest step of facial recognition technology. These controversial new powers are to be granted by the new Criminal Justice Bill, but the former independent reviewer of the technology for the Metropolitan Police has warned there are no clear limits to these plans, nor is there independent oversight for its use. I'm joined now by Chris Phillips, former head of the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office. Chris, thank you very much for joining me. Do you think it's reasonable that 50 million innocent people should be spotted by the police as they're going about their lawful business?
No, I don't actually, Jacob, and I think it is a bit of a slippery slope. There are some sensible uses of facial technology and facial recognition, and the police have been using it up until now with people that are known criminals and using them then to find those known criminals. A very sensible use of the technology. But with AI and everything that goes along with it, it's a really slippery slope that we're going to get into. And of course, once again, it's the motorist, the poor old motorist, who is at the end of this. And I think there are big causes for concern.
Particularly, we were discussing a couple of days ago, non-crime hate incidents, which the police record. If they start recording things that aren't crimes and they're looking at pictures of people who haven't committed crimes, then we are losing a fundamental freedom, aren't we?
I believe we are. And I think we just need to be careful as to where to stop this from going any further. As I said, AI and everything that goes along with it. And of course, everyone now is being followed around on your telephone and things. It's fairly easy to track people. And I think we need to have some sensible conversations about how far we're prepared to take this. And of course, having not committed any crimes, Jacob, then these people are completely innocent. So they shouldn't be on any file.
Absolutely, and that there are two risks, aren't there? One is the risk that we don't always have a benign government. And we've been lucky in this country because we've had broadly benign governments for quite a long time, but we shouldn't be complacent. And the other is the police officer, and we get this from time to time, who looks through the file to see what somebody they don't like very much is up to, a neighbour who's annoyed them a little bit is up to. You read about this from time to time. You know the sort of thing I'm thinking about, and that remains a risk.
There's always a risk of that, and there always will be. And of course, as I said, we are more tracked now than we've ever been. With our phones in our pockets, you can follow someone around the country if you so wish. But I think we need to be very careful, as I said before, that we really have a real think about what we want our governments to be able to do. And yes, of course, we're used to benign governments in this country. But things can change, and they're changing quite quickly, and we don't know what's going to come before us. And I think we need to put a stopper on this before it gets out of hand.
And so really the bill needs to keep this under very tight control, because you think there are sensible uses of it, you can track known terrorists and so on, but that the 50 million of us who are innocent motorists shouldn't just be a sort of curiosity spot for bored policemen.
Yeah, quite right. And, you would expect the police to be facially recognising terrorists as they go through airports and they go through the towns and cities, perhaps. But to put everyone's photograph on there, essentially, is what they're doing. It is just a step too far in my mind.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Still with me is my panel, GB News' very own senior political commentator Nigel Nelson and the editor of Conservative Home, Paul Goodman. Paul, what do your readers on Conservative Home think about this? Are they quite worried?
The first thing they might ask is, what's the provenance of this proposal? My understanding is it's been kind of slipped into a bill without a lot of public discussion. So the first thing any reader of Con Home or any of your viewers might ask is, well, why is this? And I think that brings us to the concerns that were being voiced a moment ago, which is this. You can be, hauled up by the police for something that's not a criminal offence. So you might say something on Twitter that the police think is derogatory, I don't know, of a sort of trans person. Or you might express a traditional Christian view about sexual conduct in a rather traditional Christian way. And you could have the police investigating it. Do you want, in this world in which we now live, the police to be able to use facial recognition on people who are not criminal suspects? I would argue, and I think at least some of our readers would, this would be a step too far, and that you can justify anything you like in the name of countering terrorism or paedophilia, but a big question arises about where the line should be drawn.
And isn't that right, Nigel? The line has to be drawn somewhere, and that part of anything else, there'll be information overload. If they're looking at 50 million people, where will they spot the ones who are actually up to serious mischief?
Well, first of all, you've got to imagine this as a database, and they've got plenty of databases they use already. It won't be an overload because computerization means that they can get to the stuff immediately. I'm pretty relaxed about something like this, that we're photographed, 700 or 800 times a day walking through London. I've got loads of pieces of ID. If I was responsible for a crime, the police could just have to go and look at the GB News archive and pick me up from that. So something like this, I think you have to always be conscious about the dangers of it. If you write an email, it could always be being read by somebody else. But always careful there.
Aren't we the frog in warm becoming boiling water? That we've had all these CCTV cameras, we're watched wherever we go, all our movements by mobiles can be tracked as they were during COVID. Now they'll be able to use facial recognition. And that actually you used to be able to go around this country without proving to anybody who you were, as long as what you were doing was lawful.
But it's like the atom bomb. You can't uninvent it. So this technology exists. I agree with you. The important thing is a benign government, and it's up to government to make sure these things are used properly and within the law. But we're going to get more of it, and I don't see a way around that. As Chris just mentioned, we voluntarily carry our phones. We can be tracked anywhere we go through them.
And Paul, is this actually a matter of trust in the police, which I think has been declining in recent years? That the police have been heavy-handed in certain instances, they haven't policed other things as we might have liked, and that therefore people, instead of thinking that the police are entirely on their side, thinks, well, they don't care about shoplifters, and they let Palestinian marchers march past the cenotaph without so much as buy your leave. And does this affect...
Or they're busy cracking down on something someone's said on Twitter rather than pursuing burglaries. I'm sure there is that feeling around, but there is a wider question I think Nigel has just raised, which is where do you draw the line given that technology marches on and you have this capacity? And I think it would be reasonable to sort of draw the line somewhere and ask, why do you need this power rather than presume that the police ought to have it?
It's also a bit of a cheat, isn't it? Because if you think back not that many years, we didn't have photographs on our driving licences. And when the government of the day said we should have them, there was no suggestion that this would then be a resource for the police to track our movements. This was simply to prove who you were when you were hiring a car abroad.
Yes, that's right. But if you remember, there was a huge row about ID cards that the last Labour government were thinking about bringing it in. We decided it was un-British. I don't think you should have things like that because I don't want to carry a card just to walk around my own country. When you actually have bits of ID, you have it because you want it for a purpose. You have a driving licence so you can drive, a passport so you can go abroad. If then the authorities are using that for facial recognition, I'm not too bothered about that.
OK, you're not too uncomfortable with that, but you think it needs proper control?
Certainly.
Excellent. Well, my panel are so brilliant, aren't they? Well, firebrand US political commentator and deposed former Fox News, that's an American television station presenter, Tucker Carlson, has caused a bit of a stir in the Twitter sphere, or the X sphere as it may now be called, this week after telling a Turning Point USA podcast his erroneous thoughts about the late, great Sir Winston Churchill. And this is what he had to say.
Well, war means war powers for the people waging the war. So these are people who think only in terms of power, acquiring it, preventing you from having it. When war broke out in 1940 in England, the government, later run by Winston Churchill, our hero, put the opposition party in prison with their families, where they stayed without charges. Don't underestimate the ability of a government at war to use its new powers to criminally crush its opponents.
Well, what Churchill in fact did was form a coalition with the leader of the opposition and put together a group of ministers who were willing to defeat the Nazis. The only people who were imprisoned were avowed Nazi sympathisers, basically traitors. This remarkable coalition that Churchill put together had a shared aim of defending our nation and its liberties against the poisonous, oppressive tyranny polluting the European continent throughout the mid-20th century. Mr. Carlson is seeking to criticise historic leaders for silencing and disenfranchising political dissenters. He really needs to look at the legacy of the man whom Winston Churchill and his peacetime supporters were united against and defeated, rather than misrepresenting the history of a great man to push an edgy social media agenda. I mean, Nigel, I think we're all going to agree on this, that yes, some people, some fifth columnists went to prison, but he formed a coalition with Attlee, and Churchill was a hater of socialism. He thought socialism was almost as bad as I think it is.
Yes, but, I mean, Tucker has simply got it wrong. What he's thinking of is Oswald Mosley, of course, who was jailed, but then Oswald Mosley would be jailed today for inciting racial hatred, so he would still be in prison either way. And yes, you're right, the whole point about the coalition government was that we were united during the Second World War. Clement Attlee as Deputy Prime Minister, Arthur Greenwood in the cabinet, two Labour politicians that Churchill never got on with.
And Arthur Greenwood so important in Churchill becoming Prime Minister, so it was the push from the opposition that in a way got him to be Prime Minister.
And when Halifax wanted to do a deal with Hitler and try and sue for peace, it was the Labour people in cabinet who turned around and backed Churchill and said no way.
Well, we all love a Winston Churchill story, which is why we're discussing this in the first place. I think it's possible that Tucker misspoke and what he sort of meant mostly, but he actually said the opposition, thereby suggesting somehow that Churchill put Attlee in prison, the man with whom, after all, he was sharing a wartime government, who, as you say, with Arthur Greenwood, they who'd been some of Churchill's strongest critics in the 20s and 30s, eventually came to the conclusion he had to be the Prime Minister who would defeat the Nazis.
So, in a spirit of Christmas goodwill, we should allow Tucker Carlson off the hook and just put it down as a sort of Bushite misspeak, rather than
we can.
A slur on Churchill.
There's another interesting point here, which is we pride ourselves, we were just talking about British liberties a few moments ago, on not imprisoning people without trial, but Churchill did bang up Mosley and his supporters like that.
Yeah, indeed, and we suspend habeas corpus during the Napoleonic Wars as well. So Pitt the Younger, another great hero, also suspends habeas corpus. It does happen.
Yeah, and if there's an emergency going on, things like that are actually accepted.
Yeah, indeed, and they become proportionate, but you're not locking up your political opponents, you're locking up people who are fundamentally against the nation succeeding.
And I think Tucker ought to correct what he said and offer an apology.
Well, I think we'll be Christmassy about it. He did an absolutely brilliant interview, which I would encourage all of you to look at, with the now President of Argentina, which is compelling viewing. There's a politician who speaks his mind. Thank you, as always, to my highly intelligent panel. Coming up, have we all become fiscal drag queens? Oh, plus, is decorking champagne
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests, and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. We've been discussing facial recognition technology, and you've been getting in touch with your views. Steve says, we seem to be becoming a police state. Seems that it's out with the Magna Carta, which is what Parliament has wanted for a number of years. And Mark says, hi, Jacob. If you think they've used our driving licences for facial recognition, then think what they've done with all the COVID tests and the DNA database that they've gathered from that. And Terry says, Tucker Carlson didn't even get the year right for the outbreak of war. He said 1940. That shows how much research he has carried out in the matter. Well, thank you for those. As always, perhaps the most tyrannical fiscal policy of all over the past year has been fiscal drag. And no, as it's pantomime season, that's actually nothing to do with men wearing women's clothes or anything like that. It's a stealth tax. Normally, as inflation drives up wages, tax thresholds increase in accordance. But the thresholds have been frozen, meaning that as people's wages have increased, they have been dragged into new tax brackets, even though in real terms they're no better off. And for death duties, it's been no different. Assets have inflated significantly over the last 15 years, but the threshold has been frozen, meaning inheritance tax has raised £5.2 billion, up £400 million on the previous year. So surely it's time, at the very least, to lift the thresholds and ultimately abolish this economically harmful tax. Well, still with me is my penultimate panel of the year. Nigel, the economic disadvantages, the misallocation of capital you get and the small revenue you get from death duties means it's a very inefficient tax.
I'm not sure 5 billion is actually a small amount. I know it's not up there with income tax.
It's 0.5% of total tax revenue.
Yeah, but it's still £5 billion, which is quite a lot of money. I mean, my objection to getting rid of inheritance tax is that so few people pay it. It doesn't affect most people. If you're a married couple, you're looking at an estate worth £1 million. So the fact that only 4 in 100 people actually pay it, that's 27,000 estates. Getting rid of it would only benefit a very few. What we should be doing is trying to help people, as many people as possible, get money in their pockets to combat the cost of living.
But the distortive effects are very powerful because the people who do pay it have an incentive to make particular types of investments. So to get the £1 million, you don't want to downsize from your family home. You want to invest in farmland or in unlisted securities to get the exemptions. This means capital is badly allocated for a small amount of government revenue. That's the bit that I'm most concerned about.
OK, but I mean, people should have the right to do what they want with their own money, shouldn't they? And the situation with the beneficiaries, that one of the criticisms has always been, this is money that tax has been paid on previously. Well, of course, it hasn't been paid by the people who actually get the inheritance. So as a tax, I'm not against it. I think there are far more important taxes to deal with before you get around to this one.
Paul, isn't inheritance tax really about social/socialist engineering? It's about hitting
I'm very puzzled by discussing any tax in the abstract rather than as a whole in the context of tax and spending. And we discovered last autumn, I'm afraid, with the Liz Truss mini-budget, that you can't just cut taxes if you can't also control your spending. So I think it's very important to make that point for the viewers, because sometimes it suggests you can just cut tax, not worry about the spending side, and you'll be fine. And I think we've learned that doesn't work. So you then turn to the question, if you can control your spending, of which taxes you cut first. Very nice discussion to have. And I have to say, if I was thinking about trying to undo some of the fiscal drag and look at raising thresholds in line with inflation, I wouldn't start with inheritance tax. I'd be looking at income tax rather than people being dragged into the 40p band, of whom a lot of your viewers will be.
Will be. And fiscal drag is a very serious issue. The reason I'm so concerned about inheritance tax is not because it's a good or bad tax in itself and in the funds it raises, because governments always have to raise a certain amount of money. It's the knock-on economic question of the misallocation of capital, and that has a much bigger economic effect, whereas income taxes and sales taxes are surprisingly efficient because people have to carry on earning and they have to carry on spending.
Well, you'd also have to take into account who the beneficiaries of the cuts are going to be in political terms. And if the gainers from inheritance tax are up at the top of the tax tree, as it were, it's always going to be more difficult for governments to help them before it turns to the mass of people in the 40p band. This is the difficulty about cutting tax at the top end of the scale.
But the difficulty with Paul's suggestion is that actually £5.2 billion would be a drop in the ocean. It wouldn't meet the fiscal drag loss for a single year.
No, and I think that I agree with Paul on this one, that we should be looking more at income taxes and personal allowances, especially at the lower end. I mean, you're not just dragging people into the 40% bracket. People who've never paid tax before, 3 million of them, are suddenly being dragged into some kind of taxation. That's the area where I think Jeremy Hunt should actually deal with.
There are also extraordinary marginal tax rises you hit at certain points when you're going through the system. And my understanding is government doesn't really want to deal with these because it's not particularly electorally attractive to do it, but they are quite staggering.
But they are. If I had a 7th child rather than a 6th child, at £50,000 I would have a marginal rate of over 100%.
Quite, but presumably because very few people have 6 or 7 children.
Well, more should have 6 or 7 children.
A priority for the government.
Anyway, there now follows a public service announcement in light of the British Medical Journal's warning about uncorking champagne. Cork eye injuries are an overlooked threat and a substantial risk to ocular health, according to the warning from the BMJ. To ensure you do not begin the new year on the operating table of an eye surgeon, visit the British Medical Journal's website, bmj.com, or follow these simple instructions. First, choose your favourite brand of champagne. Personally, I go for Bollinger. Then, select your glasses. I think coupes are more elegant than flutes, though I know the specialists dislike them. and actually you really want to drink your champagne from a silver tankard, then you have to undo the foil. But once you've undone the foil, you have the next thing, which is, of course, the wire. Now, this is when you must be careful. Always try and keep your hand on the wire, because once you've undone it, the cork can shoot off. And I have seen this happen. I've seen lights smashed and people get it in the eye. So this is the point we've got to be careful. Then, this is difficult, but turn it gently and turn the bottle and the cork slightly. And ideally, you get a sort of slight sneeze. The best waiters in the top restaurants get no more than a slight squeeze. There we go. That is how it should be. It's slightly come out because I've carried it over from home. Then pour it, spilling less than I have, but you've got the cork out safely. And then share it with your distinguished guests and your most intellectual panel and wish them a very Merry Christmas. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to offer this public service announcement on behalf of the British Medical Journal. So let's have a clip of Champagne Charlie, who also knew how to do it.
Champagne Charlie is my name. Champagne drinking is my game. There's no drink as good as fizz, fizz, fizz. I'll drink every drop there is.
Well, that was very jolly. That's all from me. I hope you have a very jolly Christmas. Next up is Patrick Christie's. Patrick, have you got some champagne on your show today?
I just tried to open a bottle and it's taken my eye out. I think I'll be all right. Anyway, Jacob, thank you very much. Look, I've got a heck of a lot on today. I went to Bartley Primary School earlier, where a mob of pro-Palestine parents shut that school down. So I've been talking to a couple of them. I'm also going to be talking as well to an eyewitness of this Prague shooting. They were just metres away from the incident as it unfolded. So obviously 15 people dead over there. It will be, I think, enlightening to get the testimony of someone who was right on the scene. I am also going to be discussing the Labour Party's rather unfortunate links to terrorism in light of James Cleverly telling us to all go and enjoy Christmas markets but watch out for terrorist acts. And is it ever OK to make your relatives pay for their Christmas dinner? I know you would never do such a thing, Jacob.
No, it wouldn't occur to me. And if I was charged for a Christmas dinner by relations, I think I might find I had another urgent appointment, some broadcasting to do or something like that. Well, that's coming up after the weather. Don't forget to tune in on Monday when State of the Nation has its very own Christmas special in which Dr. David Starkey makes a dramatic return and will be at St Augustine's in Ramsgate. Otherwise, it's going to be the weather. A happy Christmas to everybody, particularly if you're in Somerset, where it'll all be delightful.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, very good evening to you. I'm Alex Burkill here with your latest GB News weather forecast. Whilst there may be a bit of hill snow across northern parts through the next 24 hours or so, it's a milder story elsewhere. And we do still have some strong winds and some rain around, even though the deep area of low pressure we saw earlier today has now cleared away towards the east. So a blustery picture as we go through this evening and overnight. Some outbreaks of rain quite likely. Hill snow is an issue across some northern parts, particularly for Shetland. Here we could see something of an ice risk as we go through the night into Friday morning, and for many turning increasingly cloudy overnight, and with those blustery winds, temperatures not dropping much, some places in the south staying in double figures. Chillier further north across parts of Scotland, could be a touch of frost here first thing on Friday morning. Otherwise though, through the day it is going to be largely cloudy for many of us. There will be further outbreaks of rain, it is going to be blustery at times, and some more snow, perhaps some ice is likely across parts of Scotland too. Some brighter breaks developing in the southwest, and here it's still going to be relatively mild, albeit temperatures a little bit down compared to today. As we look towards Saturday, and it's a wet picture across many northern areas, particularly Scotland, western parts likely to see some heavy rainfall totals building up. A bit more snow around, again bringing the risk of some icy patches too. A drier picture further south, but quite a cloudy one with a few spots of rain possible. That rain then does gradually make its way southwards as we go through Christmas Eve, eventually clearing through as we go into Christmas Day. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us. From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. The Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests, and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.